In this series of conversations, we'll be discussing global food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them. I'm Ash Sweeting and welcome to the Ash Cloud. Today we are joined by Ruaraidh Petre, the Executive Director of the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef. Ruaraidh has used his broad experience as both a livestock producer and working on development programs in South Asia and Africa to oversee the growth of the Global Roundtable network to include 24 countries, with common goals on climate, nature-positive production and animal welfare. Roundtable members collectively aim to reduce their climate impact by 30% by 2030 on a pathway to climate neutrality, and become a net positive contributor to nature by 2030 across the vast landmass under the management of beef producers globally.
There's probably more land under the management, of people producing beef than any other individual commodity. Having access to beef producers and all of that land means you can also have impacts on how that land is managed, if you choose to do so. And at the moment, there's this oppositional attitude that we need to either control or tell people to stop doing things. I don't think that works for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's private land for the most part. And people will continue to do what's viable on that land. But secondly, you would get much more positive engagement if you incentivize the behavior that you want to see.
It began by bringing people together with diverse and frequently opposing points of view.
The first meeting of the Global Roundtable, or what was pre-Global Roundtable, was in 2010 in Denver. And at that time, we had some pretty beefy security guys in the room in case things went pear-shaped. And it was just a question of trust. A lot of those people, as you say, they'd never sat in a room before. They had not, they'd not talked to each other. They didn't necessarily trust each other. And as we sat in meeting rooms over the course of the next, 10, 12 years, people built that trust. And it's just a question of getting together regularly enough that you actually know the individuals and get to a place where you can, okay, we may not all want exactly the same thing, but we all want the same direction of travel, and we can actually learn from each other.
Methane emissions are a key focus.
While people say, cattle have always produced methane, ruminants have always produced methane, and wild ruminants will always continue to produce methane. It's something which is within our control. We can actually influence that. And if it reduces climate impact, why would we not want to do it? Having said that, the producers will always say, yeah, but who's going to pay for it? That's the big question at the moment.
Existing technologies can have a real impact.
There are also genetics companies working specifically on reducing methane. So I think that will become a thing in the future, and undoubtedly breeding has an impact. It's much more difficult to quantify at the moment. And the same is actually true of grazing management. We know that when you manage your grazing well, you get better use of your resources, so it's more efficient. But B, you can also sequester carbon.
The opportunities and challenges are frequently bundled together.
We hear so much about deforestation, particularly in Latin American countries. But what people often fail to recognize is that producers, whether they're crop producers or livestock producers in those areas, are actually some of the biggest guardians of the forest, because they're required by law to have, let's say, in the Amazon, it's 80%. So if you own a property in the Amazon, you are required to have 80% of that in native vegetation. That is a big cost, a big public good, I would say, that is a cost to the private individual.
For real impact, investment needs to align with desired outcomes.
We've heard endless calls to protect native vegetation, both in the Amazon and other biomes around the world, but we do not see the level of investment that actually competes with agriculture. Until we see real money that can improve livelihoods going into those places, we're not going to see the level of protection that people want to see.
A huge investment disparity continues to exist between livestock and the other agricultural industries.
In agricultural development projects in lower income countries, it was about 2%. So 2% of the funds that went into agriculture went to livestock, and the other 98% went into whichever crops it might be. So there is an absolutely massive disparity, and while that's official development assistance, the same applies to government investment in their own countries.
How do livestock fit into our societies?
Well, what is the social role of beef production, both for the producer side, but also for the rest of society, like maintenance of landscapes, provision of nutrition, and provision of employment and livelihoods? In lower income countries, particularly those which are more arid, livestock is the cornerstone of food production and is in desperate need of support.
Rory, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for asking me. Pleasure.
Climate change and biodiversity are two of the greatest environmental and food sustainability challenges that we're currently facing. And the beef industry is frequently held within the media and other conversations as being a key contributor to both of those issues. How and what's the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef doing to address those issues on the ground, but also within those conversations and debates that are going on across the broader society?
Yeah, we set goals in 2021 for three things, for both those: climate, nature positive production, as we term it, and animal welfare. And the goal on climate is to reduce our climate impact by 30% by 2030 on a pathway to climate neutrality. And our nature positive goal is to become a net positive contributor to nature by 2030. And we follow that up with activity. So in terms of climate, we have developed a life cycle footprint guideline for the beef industry, because there wasn't a global one. We based that on the work of FAO's LEAP project, and this can now be applied in any country. And New Zealand was the first country to use that. Beef and Lamb New Zealand was the first to use it on a national level. And it's now available to many countries that don't yet have a footprint. And obviously, a baseline is the important first step on knowing that you're actually reducing your impact. So that's one of the things we've done. And we're now obviously looking at projects that are having an impact in reducing climate impacts, as well as improving biodiversity. So think about grazing management projects, carbon sequestration. But when you do that, you're not just locking away carbon in the soil, you're also improving other ecosystem functions like water and biodiversity.
Okay, what are there any particular tools or projects or areas that you, because if you think through the I guess the research landscape and ideas and technology generation landscape, there's a lot of talk about various different things. There's also, what's less frequently discussed is the various timeframes immediately available, medium term and long term. And I guess for these different technologies or strategies to be implemented, how do you see that rolling out? And I guess what do you see, or what most excites you in the immediate term, the medium term and the long term?
So I think in the short term, there's a lot of focus on feed additives, particularly in more intensive situations where you've got cattle feeding from a bunk, because you can add a feed additive at controlled amounts, and that can have a pretty much instantaneous impact on the amount of enteric emissions. So that, and those are being adopted by some pretty big players, certainly trialed at large scale by companies like JBS in Brazil and Cargill in the US. And, you know, those projects will definitely have an impact at the feedlot level. Having those available for use in rangeland or grazing situations is a little bit more complicated, but there is work at the moment on developing a rumen bolus, which would be a slow release version of the same kind of product. At the moment, I'm not aware that those are actually commercially available, but they're reaching the stage that they're viable to use. The point will always be, how much does that cost, and who bears the cost? Because individual producers are not, at the moment in most countries, under any requirement to do this. So it would be a benefit to a processing company who maybe has a science-based target, and that falls within their Scope 3 emissions. So I can see that there will be some projects where the bigger corporations up the supply chain are supporting the implementation of these kind of projects, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay, what about the use of existing tools or practices that farmers or producers currently use or have in their back pocket, like breeding for reduced emissions, and then I guess the grazing management side of things? How do you see those fitting into the process?
Yeah, so the genetic side, there's also been quite considerable advances on that, and we have a few genetics companies involved in GRSB who've been working on this. There are a couple of breeds. Hereford, I know in some countries, has included residual feed intake in their genetic indexes, and that is kind of a proxy. So if you select for a bull with a lower RFI, you can also reduce the amount of methane, but it's not, at the moment, that is not indexed in such a way that you can say, well, if we use this bull, we're going to get a reduction of X% of methane. So while we know that it would have an impact, we don't quite know exactly what the impact is, and we don't know whether that's consistent in all situations. So there are trials going on at the moment to work these details out, and there are also genetics companies working specifically on reducing methane. So I think that will become a thing in the future, and undoubtedly breeding has an impact. It's much more difficult to quantify at the moment. And the same is actually true of grazing management. We know that when you manage your grazing well, you get better use of your resources, so it's more efficient, but B, you can also sequester carbon. The problem with it is that at the moment, not enough, I guess, has been invested into soil testing and sampling methodologies to make sure that we can do it cheaply. So at the moment, soil testing is pretty expensive, and people are kind of slow to adopt it. There are tons of projects at the moment on soil carbon sequestration, and people being paid money already. In Australia, there are, I believe, 350 projects. So clearly in Australia, the government has set up a mechanism which is allowing farmers to do this. And I know that the carbon farmers of Australia have been very active in getting that all working. But I have a feeling that in some countries where there are projects, that they're kind of, they're ahead of the science. In other words, they've set up a project before they really know how to quantify what they're doing. And I would be a little bit nervous about entering into something like that, because you need to make sure the methodology is right. Otherwise, you may get stung later if it turns out that you haven't sequestered what you promised you would.
On that note, do you see, I guess, industry strategic risk if you've got these people out there ahead of the science and they are they can't necessarily quantify things as robustly as they should. And then if they end up falling flat on their face because they were running too far ahead of the science, then they bring or that tarnishes the industry as a whole. And what can be done to manage that from that strategic risk perspective?
Yeah, I do think it's a concern. And the other side of that, which I think probably relates to it, is about selling of credits to entities entirely out of the chain. I would say what's really important for producers is insetting. Like it's important that we get this carbon in the soil. It's important that our soil is healthy, and it's important that other ecosystem functions are running in a positive way. And if we can keep that on the farm or on the property, then we'll have got the benefit already. Sure, it'd be nice to be paid some extra for that, but let's wait till the science catches up and then look for the payments, rather than chasing the payment before we really know what we've actually achieved. I think it's a risk because, as you pointed out at the beginning, the beef industry is widely criticized for all kinds of things, sometimes unfairly and sometimes fairly. So we need to make sure we do these things properly. Otherwise, people will just sort of shrug and say, "Oh yeah, that's the beef industry for you." So I'm nervous about getting too far ahead of the time.
With regard to the conversation about the beef industry and what you just mentioned in terms of it being blamed frequently for a lot of the climate issues, the debate is generally quite simplistic. Cows produce methane, they lead to deforestation, they're bad, and it doesn't consider so many other of the impacts or engagements the industry has within our societies. Things like the fact that the industry is a huge employer in certain parts of the world, both as on the production side of things, but also on the processing or logistics side of things. There's millions or hundreds of millions of acres that are actually managed by the beef industry. Probably more land mass on the planet is managed by the beef industry. So in terms of actually getting access to that land, there's a conduit through the beef industry that no other industry provides, as well as the fact that, especially in parts of Africa and other and South Asia, potentially owning livestock is a sign of social status, a sign of wealth as well. So they fit into societies differently there as well. And in our Western societies, eating beef is a big part of many of our sort of cultural and social interactions. So do you see expanding the conversation to include these greater complexities as being something that needs to be done? And if so, what can we do to broaden that perspective?
Yeah, I think at the moment there's been such a polarization on all kinds of issues, and there are a number of groups who have chosen to oppose the beef industry because it doesn't fit with their vision of how the world should function. But the simple fact is, you're right. There's probably more land under the management, of people producing beef than any other individual commodity. Now, I don't have any facts to back that up, but it just feels logically correct, because by its nature, grazing is an extensive operation, not an intensive one. So we tend to use the most marginal areas. And those areas are large because they can't produce much, and they can't produce crops. So, there's a simplistic idea that if everybody stopped eating meat, they could eat more crops. Well, we don't have more land to produce crops, except in areas which are biodiversity hotspots like the Amazon anyway. So sure, you could grow more soy in the Amazon, but I'm pretty sure that nobody wants us to do that. So to provide food from these vast acreages of grasslands, rangelands, and savannas, we have to use ruminants. So that is something that's kind of commonly glossed over. And as you point out, having access to beef producers and all of that land means you can also have impacts on how that land is managed. if you choose to do so. And at the moment, there's this oppositional attitude that we need to either control or tell people to stop doing things. I don't think that works for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's private land for the most part, and people will continue to do what's viable on that land. But secondly, you would get much more positive engagement if you incentivize the behavior that you want to see. So I really think that there needs to be a shift from this oppositional attitude towards a more cooperative one of, well, you guys have got this resource, which we think is important to the world. How do we work with you so that we're all getting the best out of it?
On that note, you've now got over 100 members of the Global Roundtable, and I guess when you're looking through the list, you see what you could describe as potentially strange bedfellows. You've got a number of major environmental NGOs, you've got some global food companies, and then all the usual players of those people involved in either research and development in the beef industry or the farmer alliances and stuff like that. What do you think's changed in terms of that's brought these, what people would have seen as necessarily on different sides of the debate, to the same table? And also, I'd be really interested to hear from your perspective how you've, as the leader of the Global Roundtable, how you've managed to bring them together as well, and what that process has been like.
It's quite interesting. So when we first had the first meeting of the Global Roundtable, or what was pre-Global Roundtable, was in 2010 in Denver, and at that time we had some pretty beefy security guys in the room in case things went pear-shaped, and it was just a question of trust. A lot of those people, as you say, they'd never sat in a room before. They had not they'd not talked to each other. They didn't necessarily trust each other. So you had these NGOs which, for whatever reason, in different countries, didn't resonate well with the producer community. You had processors who didn't like talking to producers because they felt that they had the upper hand and they wanted to keep it. So there were lots of reasons why these people didn't talk. But I think the beef industry was under such a lot of pressure at that time that everybody realized we needed to at least get together to define sustainability. And as we sat in meeting rooms over the course of the next 10, 12 years, people built that trust. And it's just a question of getting together regularly enough that you actually know the individuals and get to a place where you can, okay, we may not all want exactly the same thing, but we all want the same direction of travel, and we can actually learn from each other. So it's been really interesting. It's been quite difficult sometimes, but there's lots of good things that have come out of it. And we've now got roundtables, 12 roundtables around the world, so national level ones, covering a total of 24 countries, because some have more than one country.
And how has having that diverse group of people at the table changed the debate, the discussion, and potentially, the ideas or solutions that have been pursued?
Well, hugely. I would say that at the beginning, there was a lot of defensiveness from the beef industry, people saying, well, it's not true, or it wasn't me, or, everybody else is to blame as well, to the point now where everybody's saying, yeah, look, this is a problem. We know that there are things that we're already doing that can improve the situation. We're researching new options. It's just a far more positive attitude to, we can be part of the change that we all need. And one of the biggest changes, I would say, was the actual recognition that climate change is a thing. Now, that probably sounds really weird to most people, but there was a strong attitude amongst the producer community 10 years ago that climate change wasn't really a thing, or that it wasn't caused by human activities, or that there was nothing that any of us could do to solve it. And that has really changed.
With regards to what you mentioned about the blame game and people pointing the finger at the beef industry, and I guess how I see that, that's looking backwards, and actually where we've got to at the current situation is, fossil fuels and the oil energy industry has an absolutely monumental part to play in it, as does concrete production, as does so many other things. And it's a bit like if you're on a boat that's sinking and you start blaming who put the hole in the hull, it's rather an irrelevant conversation, because while you're arguing about whose fault it is, the boat suddenly is continually getting lower and lower in the water. And one of the ways I see this is it's not really relevant what's to blame. Us humans at the end of the day are to blame because of what's happened over the last post-industrial revolution period. But where the beef industry comes into it, one is the access to possibly more land than across the planet than any other industry. And the other thing is that methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than any of the others. So it's almost like the beef industry has the most leverage to make change, aside from, and that's apart from the blame game. So how do you see that debate kind of being more evolved in a positive direction to see the opportunities the beef industry provide rather than looking backwards?
Yeah, I mean, the whole land issue and the sheer amount of land, the sheer area that's available, is clearly something that has been recognized by other industries, because they are going to producers and they're asking them for carbon credit. So that's already been recognized, and there are already transactions taking place. I think pretty high profile example was with the Wilmot Cattle Company in Australia a couple of years ago. And I think it was Gates that they sold the credits to. And the other thing about methane is that it's also a really quick impact. So methane is a very potent gas, but it only remains in the atmosphere for 10 to 12 years. So if you can reduce methane from any source, and that includes from the fossil fuel industry, where they have, leaky pipelines, fixing those, it has a huge impact. And the same if we can reduce it from cattle, because that potent gas will completely disappear within 10 years. So you're taking all of that warming away. And I think that recognition, while people say, yeah, okay, cattle have always produced methane, ruminants have always produced methane, and wild ruminants will always continue to produce methane. It's something which is within our control. We can actually influence that. And if it reduces climate impact, why would we not want to do it? It seems just kind of obvious when you stop and think about it.
Oh, completely. So go on.
Having said that, the producers will always say, yeah, but who's going to pay for it? That's the big question at the moment.
Isn't that one of, I guess, the key attributes to, it goes back to for something to be truly sustainable, it needs to be technically or scientifically sustainable, as well as socially sustainable, as well as financially sustainable. And it's like a tripod. If you don't have all three legs there, the whole thing's not going to stand up for very long.
100%. And we're asking producers, and society has been asking producers for more and more. We need transparency. We want to know where our beef's coming from, so that we know that it's having a positive environmental impact. We want to know that the animals have been treated well, and we want it to have less of an impact on climate. So all of these things, they're being asked for, and they're not receiving necessarily more money at the farm gate. So, there comes a point where the cost of doing all these things, obviously they're going to need to be paid for it, because otherwise there'll be no beef. People will simply do things which pay them better.
With regard to the gaps in terms of technology or cultural change or other areas where, or investment or financial gaps, where do you see the greatest need to put more attention or resources or investment?
There are lots of areas where I think more investment's needed. Like, we hear so much about deforestation, particularly in Latin American countries. But what people often fail to recognize is that producers, whether they're crop producers or livestock producers in those areas, are actually some of the biggest guardians of the forest, because they're required by law to have, let's say, in the Amazon, it's 80%. So if you own a property in the Amazon, you are required to have 80% of that in native vegetation. That is a big cost, a big public good, I would say, that is a cost to the private individual. And we've started to see some project last year at COP27, a group including Itaú, Marfrig, Rabobank, and a few others, put together a company called Biomas, and they're going to protect 4 million hectares of land. And I think that kind of investment is going to be important in the future, because your governments aren't doing it. Like, we've heard endless calls to protect native vegetation, both in the Amazon and other biomes around the world, but we do not see the level of investment that actually competes with agriculture. I think it's logical that the Brazilian government wants the livelihoods of its population to improve. So they want to see economic development. And the amount of money that flows in for that wildly offsets anything that's supposed to be protecting the forest. So until we see real money that can improve livelihoods going into those places, we're not going to see the level of protection that people want to see. So that's one area of investment, and that's a huge amount of money. Like, that's not a technical thing, that's just a structural thing. How do we protect biodiversity?
What you just said reminds me of, I guess I was working back in the UK at the beginning of the century, and the role of a British farmer was producing food, obviously, but everyone in Britain likes to see the English countryside look like the English countryside, have the nice stone walls, the hedgerows maintained properly, etc. And for a long time, the subsidies to EU and British agriculture were all through food, or through what the farmers were producing, rather than aligned to the different objectives. And all you did was distort the food prices. The farmers didn't make any more money, and they were just kind of doing the countryside maintenance as a sort of a sideline thing. And then by aligning the financial incentives with the actual work you wanted to get done, that very much changed the balance of how things worked and where efforts and et cetera were going. Do you see that as a relevant comparison?
Yeah, and there are definitely countries where that is already happening. I mean, in fact, I was farming in Scotland in the sort of early to mid 90s, and even at that stage, we had extensification payments. In other words, we were paid for the type of management which wasn't related to our output at all. So it's been happening, and I think it probably, the problem for governments, I guess, is that's usually a fairly significant chunk of money spent on what they view as a very small part of the population. In most countries, the agricultural industries employ 2% or fewer of the population, so it's not a big voting base. And unless that it's really going to impact on their voters, and their voters are going to see the return on it, there's not a lot of political currency in that kind of thing. You need to spin it in a way that's going to get the voter excited, unfortunately, because you can definitely bring the farmer along with you, but can you bring the voter along with you? There's a lot of rural-urban divide creates some resentment sometimes about who's getting the money for what, and I think on both sides feel that the other is getting an undue share. And it's just a difficult political game for a party to play, to say, well, we're going to support these guys, when somebody else is definitely going to be able to point at a underprivileged group in a city and say, well, why aren't you spending the money on them? It's difficult.
That goes back into the what we were discussing earlier about the social and political challenges about reaching more sustainable production, rather, because there's so much focus is generally on the technical challenges. Do you think we need to invest more money into addressing these social and political issues?
Yeah, it's funny, because when you talk about communications between agriculture and the general population, a lot of what you hear from producers is, we need to educate people about what we're doing. It's like, yeah, people are not sitting around waiting to be educated by you. And they, of course, there's probably an interest. People do have an interest in where their food comes from. But the way that you communicate with people is really important. And if it's all about me telling you that this is the way we do things and that's all fine, then it's not going to work. There needs to be a two-way communication, and there needs to be a lot more listening and probably a lot less talking to really get that rapport going again. Because at the moment there feels like there's too much of a sort of fight going on between the various parties.
Is that something that you see as part of your role or in your wheelhouse to try and lead that change in communication, or is that sort of falling elsewhere? And if elsewhere, where do you see, I guess, opportunities to drive that forward?
Yeah, so GRSB doesn't really communicate directly with consumers because we've got consumers in too many different countries, but the national roundtables do communicate with consumers. So what we do is we do run regular communication workshops for industry and for the producer side. And this is more about how they might do it in their own country, and then they can take some of the things that we discuss back and put them in the right context. And the other communication that GRSB does is directly with policymakers. So at global forums, things like the climate COP or the biodiversity COP, we would want to be communicating with the policymakers at those events to try and bring across some of the complexity of the situation.
The livestock industries have, on the whole, I guess, received possibly orders of magnitude less investment, especially for innovation and startups, than the cropping industries, especially the broadacre cropping industries. Is that something you've dug into and analysed? And if so, what's your thoughts on why that's happened and what can be done to change that balance?
I've looked at it actually across my career. So prior to doing this job, I worked more in development work, and we saw that in agricultural development projects in lower income countries, it was about 2%. So 2% of the funds that went into agriculture went to livestock, and the other 98% went into whichever crops it might be. So there is an absolutely massive disparity, and while that's official development assistance, the same applies to government investment in their own countries, and it's always to do with, I think, the marginal areas and the perceptions about the importance of the products that are flowing from different areas and the ability to improve them. So I think to some extent there's always been this sort of technocratic view that, if we can do something that looks impressive and uses shiny machines, that will be good for our economy and for our agricultural production. And that isn't so much a part of livestock production. That's just a feeling. But we do need to change it, because in lower income countries, particularly those which are more arid, livestock is the cornerstone of food production and is in desperate need of support, because in many cases these farmers have no capital to make any change. Like, they might be very willing to adapt their system or to do things differently, but they just don't have the capital to start that. And most change costs money. You're not going to change things just by wishful thinking.
What role do you have in terms of, or do you have any role in terms of providing guidance on how resources or money's invested? Or is that what you said before, as in a very soft power type approach through speaking with development agencies or policy makers or certain members within your group that have research and development funds at their disposal?
Yeah, I would say the latter. We're not directly involved in that, but we are encouraging our members to obviously invest in the areas that are priorities for GRSB. And I think that for the majority of our members, they're also, that they share those priorities anyway. And when we're talking to national governments or these UN forums, we definitely bring that message. The same message that we've been discussing today. We're talking about vast areas of land and the livelihoods of large numbers of people that could be influenced, probably in comparison with some other projects, at relatively low cost. So, we could have a big impact. And those are the kind of discussions we have with policymakers.
Rory, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. Is there anything else that you would like to add that you think is important we haven't already discussed?
Yeah, so I mentioned that we already have 3 goals. We're actually setting a new goal this year as well, a social goal, which will relate to some of the questions that you've been asking me. So I'll probably have some better answers for you in about a year's time when we've really taken a dive into, well, what is the social role of beef production, both for the producer side, but also for the rest of society, like maintenance of landscapes, provision of nutrition, and provision of employment and livelihoods. So that will be an interesting piece of work that we're really just embarking on now.
That it's interesting because, as an Australian example, in the last decade, all the automotive industry, manufacturing industry shut down in Australia, and that meant that the red meat industry and the processing industry was the largest manufacturing employee across the whole country, and that's frequently not added to conversations about the beef industry and just the impact that has for jobs, especially in those communities, often regional and rural communities, where those companies provide, they're possibly the only employer in town.
Yeah, I was at a meeting in Brisbane a couple of weeks ago where we were discussing some of these social issues, and certainly opened my eyes and helped me think about what we're going to include in our global social goal.
Well, Roy, thank you very much for talking to me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash. See ya.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Ruaraidh Petre, recorded in California in March 2023.